Welcome to Thunga's Storytime. Today, we're diving into the surprising truth behind what it really meant to be rich in medieval times. Imagine living a life of luxury, sumptuous feasts, fine wines, and grand parties, but secretly battling a painful disease called gout, known as the disease of kings. This is the story of Lord William Thornbrook, a nobleman trapped in a golden cage of wealth, expectation, and agony. But his journey doesn't stop there. It's a tale of pain, awakening, and the surprising lessons that changed not only his life but the way he ruled. Stick around, this medieval story might just change how you think about power, health, and what it truly means to be wealthy. The year was 1398. Deep in the English countryside, far from the clamor of cities and battlefields, a great stone manor stood watch over the rolling hills and windswept fields of Thornbrook Estate. Inside, behind thick tapestries and under a heavy woolen canopy, Lord William Thornbrook stirred in his grand bed. He was a man of title, wealth, and power, a nobleman whose name carried weight from the local village chapel to the royal court. His family crest, stitched in gold, hung above his hearth. His boots were polished by the hands of servants before the sun rose. His table groaned nightly with roasted meats, candied fruits, and cups overflowing with deep red wine. But on this night, for all his privilege and comfort, William Thornbrook found no rest. The pain began as a dull pulse in his foot, somewhere near the base of his big toe. He shifted beneath the linen sheets, groaning softly. Within minutes, the throb sharpened into a stabbing agony that sent sweat to his brow. He threw off the covers and sat upright. The room was cold, but his foot burned with heat. His toe, his right big toe, was swollen, angry, and red as a ripe cherry. He had felt this before, but never so severe. He knew what it was. Everyone in his class did. Gout, the disease of kings. Once a mark of status, now a tormenting reality. In the flickering light of a bedside candle, William clenched his teeth and cursed the excesses that had led him here. Too many banquets, too many rich dishes, too many nights spent reclining while others toiled. He was paying the price, not in coin, but in pain. During the day, Thornbrook Castle was a place of grand pageantry. Peacocks strutted across the courtyard. Musicians played lute and pipe in the main hall. Nobles gathered around long wooden tables covered in silver goblets, roasted boar, and intricate pastries layered with cream and sugar. Lord William was always at the head of the table, dressed in velvet and brocade, his goblet never empty. To his guests and allies, he was the picture of prosperity. But behind the scenes, his body had begun to revolt. And tonight, it made that rebellion known. As the hours passed, sleep remained distant. William sat slouched in his high-backed chair, his foot propped on a pillow, watching the candle melt. He remembered old jokes whispered among noblemen, how gout was the tax one paid for being too fortunate. But it didn't feel funny now. It felt like fire in his bones. He looked toward the window, where moonlight traced the frost on the glass. Beyond that pane lay his lands, acres of barley, wheat, and rye. And beyond the fields, in small huts clustered near the woods, lived the people who worked that land. The peasants. The laborers. The ones who rose before dawn and returned at dusk with mud-caked boots and blistered hands. They ate simply, stale bread, turnips, maybe a bit of salted pork if the harvest had been good. No sugared almonds. No imported wine. No roasted goose stuffed with figs. They would never know the comforts of Thornbrook's long table. But, William now realized, they might also never know this particular kind of pain. The irony was not lost on him. In his pursuit of every luxury, he had acquired a misery the poor were spared. Gout, it turned out, did not care for power. It came for those who overindulged. And William had indulged in everything: rich sauces, wine aged in foreign cellars, buttery pastries baked with imported cinnamon. He had dined like a king, and now suffered like one. The pain had come before, nagging reminders that his body wasn't what it once was. But this was something else. It felt like a punishment. A message. A warning written in inflammation. He rang the servant bell, not expecting sleep to find him. Down the hall, the physician would be roused. Potions would be poured. Poultices would be applied. There would be talk of imbalanced humors and hot blood. None of it would make sense, and none of it would help, not yet. What Lord William Thornbrook didn't know, not on this night, was that this pain would be the start of something much larger than an aching foot. It would become the beginning of a change, one that no amount of wealth could force, but that suffering would demand. For now, though, he was simply a man in pain. A man who had everything except peace. And in the cold, candlelit silence of his chamber, that truth was louder than any banquet song. The first grey light of morning crept in through the narrow, arched window of Thornbrook Castle. Lord William Thornbrook, still sleepless from the torment in his foot, sat wrapped in a wool cloak, staring out at the waking world beyond the stone walls. From this high window in his private chamber, he could see the vast estate that bore his family name. Fields stretched out in every direction, furrowed lines of soil cut into the earth like scripture, sacred and endless. In the distance, a thin column of smoke rose from the village cottages, signaling the start of another day for those who lived far below his station. There, in the early chill, William could see the figures of peasants beginning their work. Men with rough hands and hunched shoulders walked behind oxen, plowing the hard ground. Women stooped to gather herbs or tend goats. Children ran between vegetable plots, their laughter faint but real. Their garments were plain, undyed wool, patched linen, simple leather belts. Mud clung to their feet and hams. Their breath steamed in the cold air. They looked tired already, but they looked alive. And for the first time in many years, William did not look upon them with disdain or detachment. He looked with longing. He thought of what they would eat: rough, heavy loaves of black bread, made from coarse rye. A watery turnip stew simmered in a single pot over the hearth. Maybe a small wedge of aged cheese. Perhaps a wild apple from the edge of the woods, if the season allowed. No roasted pheasant. No sugared almonds. No meat-stuffed pies baked in elaborate molds shaped like lions or swans. It was a diet he had once mocked, fit only for the low-born, he had said with a smirk over goblets of wine. But now, with the throbbing in his foot still raw, that same diet seemed like a kind of deliverance. Clean. Humble. Uncomplicated. Pain has a way of rewriting what we value. He turned away from the window and looked back toward the remains of last night's meal, still sitting untouched on a silver tray: a half-eaten venison leg, thick with grease; a spiced honey cake, cut cleanly but left uneaten; a goblet of wine, dark as ink, its scent now sour and heavy. He used to find comfort in such excess. Now, just the sight of it made his stomach twist. Somewhere deep inside, a thought stirred, quiet and unwelcome: maybe the poor had it better. Not in terms of shelter or safety. Certainly not in terms of ease. Their lives were hard, uncertain, ruled by the harvest and the whim of weather. Illness visited them as often as it did him, but with fewer remedies. But they moved. They worked. They breathed the clean air and ate simply. They woke to pain in the back, not in the bones. And they could rest at night without the guilt of overindulgence weighing heavy on their souls or their stomachs. He envied that. He envied the simplicity. Once, years ago, a young plowboy had been caught sneaking apples from the manor orchard. William had ordered the boy beaten, to teach him the cost of dishonesty. He remembered how the boy had cried out, not from pain, but from shame. And he remembered how, that very night, he himself had eaten a banquet of honey-roasted lamb with mint, pears poached in wine, and custard thick enough to stand a spoon in. He had eaten so much he had to recline for hours afterward. It hadn't bothered him then. Now, looking back, it did. Was it truly dishonesty to take an apple when you had none? Was it truly noble to feast until sick while others lived on broth and crusts? His head throbbed with questions, and his foot throbbed with pain. Each pulse felt like a judgment. There is a certain myth that surrounds wealth, especially in a time like his. People believed that riches brought freedom. That gold could purchase peace, status could guarantee happiness, and power could shield one from suffering. But William now saw that wealth often worked more like a trap than a key. It demanded proof, constant proof. One could not simply be rich. One had to display it, perform it, wear it like a second skin. Every meal had to impress. Every feast had to outdo the last. To dine modestly, to live simply, would be seen as a sign of weakness, or worse, failure. He was expected to host hunting parties in winter and tournaments in spring, to wear furs even when not cold, to commission paintings of himself in golden robes, to gift rare wine from France to his allies even as his tenants struggled to repair thatched roofs blown off by storms. And beneath it all, he knew, was fear of falling. Fear that if he stopped performing wealth, it might slip from his fingers. The peasants may have feared hunger. But the nobility? They feared irrelevance. As the sun began to climb, a light knock came at his chamber door. "Enter," he said, wincing as he shifted his foot. A servant stepped inside with fresh linens and a tray of morning tea. She was young, pale from the cold, and quiet. "Would my lord like bread this morning?" she asked. "Plain or rye, fresh baked?" William hesitated. He glanced once more at the greasy remains from the night before, then back at the girl. "Yes," he said finally. "Rye bread. No butter." She bowed slightly and turned to go. "And some of that turnip stew from the kitchen, if any remains from last night." She looked surprised but nodded and left. It was not a grand request. But for William, it felt like an act of rebellion. Against the expectations. Against the trap. Against himself. As he leaned back, wincing again at the tender throb in his foot, he realized something important. He had been a prisoner in a very fine cage. The walls were velvet. The locks were gold. But it was a cage all the same. He had mocked the peasants for their meager lives, but perhaps they had a kind of freedom he'd never known, the freedom to live without constant performance, without the need to prove one's worth with every bite, every stitch, every party. They lived close to the ground, but they walked it with bare feet and honest hunger. And as strange as it seemed, William Thornbrook, lord of the manor, envied them. Not their poverty, but their simplicity. Their unburdened meals. Their nights of rest. And as his gaze drifted once more to the window, where the peasants worked beneath the rising sun, he wondered, not for the first time, whether true richness might lie somewhere entirely different than gold or silk or wine. Diagnosis and treatment. The fire in Lord William Thornbrook's toe had not subsided by the afternoon. If anything, it had grown more insistent, as if some cruel spirit had decided to twist a red-hot needle into the base joint of his big toe and keep turning. He had tried everything within reason, or, rather, within tradition. His valet had fetched ice from the kitchen cellar, wrapping it in thick linens and pressing it to William's foot. A servant attempted a poultice of mashed leeks and vinegar, something his grandmother used to swear by. The household chaplain muttered a quick prayer and sprinkled a few drops of holy water on the floorboards. Nothing worked. The pain throbbed like a drumbeat in his bones. So, at last, they sent for physician Gilbert. Gilbert was a man of calm demeanor and many years' experience, having served the Thornbrook family for nearly 2 decades. He wore a long robe dyed with madder root and carried with him a satchel of vials, dried herbs, and small bronze instruments that clinked like wind chimes when he walked. He entered the chamber slowly, nodding to Lady Eleonora and gently gesturing for everyone else to leave the room. The fire crackled in the hearth. The air smelled of beeswax candles and lavender satchels tucked beneath the bedding. Lord William, lying back on a mountain of pillows, winced as he tried to adjust his leg. "Well then," Gilbert said softly, as he pulled up a stool beside the bed, "let us have a look at this rebellious toe." The medieval science of suffering. In the 14th century, the dominant framework for understanding health was not bacteria, viruses, or genetics, but humors. According to Galenic medicine, which had been the gold standard since Roman times, the human body was composed of 4 primary fluids, or humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, sometimes referred to as cholera. Health was seen as a delicate balance between them. Illness occurred when one or more of these humors became excessive or deficient, or, worse, corrupted. Lord William's symptoms: severe pain, inflammation, redness, and swelling localized to one joint, told Gilbert all he needed to know. "It is an overabundance of yellow bile," he announced solemnly, peering at the swollen toe like a scholar examining a rare map. "Too much heat and dryness in the body. An internal fire. It gathers in the joints, especially in men of your station." William groaned. "You mean men of means?" Gilbert did not deny it. "Gout," he said, "has long been known to afflict men of great appetite and refined indulgence. It is often called morbus dominorum, the disease of lords. That was not entirely untrue. In medieval Europe, gout had a curious social reputation. It was a nobleman's disease, almost a symbol of elite status. Peasants rarely got it. They didn't consume enough meat, sugar, or wine to develop the condition. But for the wealthy, those who dined on venison, swan, boar, wine-soaked pastries, and imported sweets, it was a painful badge of excess. In some absurd way, William realized, his agony was proof that he had made it. The food that bites back. Gilbert pulled from his satchel a small leather-bound notebook, dog-eared and smudged with years of use. He began listing aloud the foods and drinks that had likely offended Lord William's internal balance. Red wine. Meat from game animals. Sugared plums. Honeyed mead. Those little grape jellies you favor at banquets. They all heat the liver and stimulate the yellow bile. William grunted. I don't eat them all at once. You don't need to, Gilbert replied. But you do eat them often. That is enough. Lady Eleanora raised an eyebrow. And the treatment? Gilbert closed his book with a sigh. Well, he began, there are methods. Though none of them pleasant. A catalogue of painful cures. Gilbert explained that the first step would be to restore balance among the humors, which, in practical terms, meant bleeding. That was the go-to solution for most ailments in the Middle Ages. By releasing the portion of blood, it was thought the body could reset its internal equilibrium. William had endured bloodletting before, during a bout of fever years ago, and the memory of it still made him queasy. He shook his head. No blades, he muttered. Try something else first. Gilbert nodded. Very well. We'll begin with the gentler remedies. He reached into his satchel and produced a bundle of dried herbs, meadowsweet, willow bark, and devil's claw, crushed and mixed with vinegar to make a pungent poultice. Meadowsweet, in particular, was known among folk healers for its ability to cool the blood. It smelled slightly sweet, like damp hay. Gilbert wrapped it in linen and laid it across the inflamed toe. But that was only the beginning. To ease the pain, Gilbert offered a syrup made from poppy sap, a rudimentary form of opium. It dulled the mind and brought temporary relief. Lord William swallowed the bitter draught and felt his consciousness grow cloudy. The pain momentarily blurred at the edges. And then Gilbert presented his most serious suggestion. There is one plant, he said cautiously, used only in the most severe cases. He pulled out a small wooden vial, sealed tightly. Inside was a golden powder, the dried bulb of the autumn crocus, known in Latin as Colchicum autumnale, but more commonly called dogsbane. In small doses, it was miraculous. It could calm the inflammation, reduce swelling, and ease the torment of gout. But in slightly larger amounts, it could stop a man's heart. Is it worth the risk? William asked, eyeing the vial. Gilbert hesitated. Only if we have exhausted all else. In truth, colchicine, the active compound in autumn crocus, is still used today as one of the most effective treatments for gout. But in the 14th century, physicians had no way to measure dosage precisely. It was, quite literally, a gamble. For now, William opted to wait. But the pain was not patient. The medicine of suffering. By twilight, the poultice had grown cold, and the poppy syrup had worn off. The pain crept back like an unwelcome guest. Lady Eleanora sat by his bedside, reading aloud from a psalter, her voice steady, her presence grounding. Outside, the evening bells tolled in the village chapel, and the scent of burning wood drifted in through the cracked window. William, half drowsing, murmured, "What if this is what comes of luxury?" Eleanora paused. "What do you mean?" He sighed. "What if the very things we pursue, rich food, comfort, idleness, are not rewards, but traps?" His wife said nothing, but her hand found his, resting lightly atop it. And in that moment, Lord William Thornbrook began to wonder whether the pain in his foot was not just a symptom of illness, but a message, a quiet warning from his body, urging him to reconsider the life he had built around indulgence. The poultices might ease the swelling. The opiates might dull the ache. But the root of the sickness, he realized, went deeper than flesh. The burden of status. As the days passed and Lord William Thornbrook remained confined to his chamber with his aching foot propped on silken pillows, the pain began to fade, slightly. The swelling receded just enough for him to put pressure on the floor again, though he still limped like a sailor fresh off a month at sea. But the pain in his toe was not the only weight he carried. In truth, the sharper sting came not from inflamed joints, but from the quiet tension pressing in around him, expectation, reputation, and the relentless theater of noble life. William was not just any man. He was a lord, a title inherited from generations before him, bound by fealty to a king and by unwritten rules to a world of nobles who watched one another with delight, sharpened interest. In the medieval world, status was not just privilege, it was performance. And that performance never ended. A stage without rest. Even in his weakened state, William knew that appearances must be maintained. His stewards continued to manage the estate in his stead, but questions had begun to circulate. Was Lord Thornbrook ill? Was he growing feeble? Had he lost his appetite, his strength, his wealth? In courtly circles, rumors were a currency more dangerous than gold. To maintain his standing, William was expected to host feasts, entertain guests, and flaunt abundance at every turn. The nobility, those who lived not by tilling the land but by securing alliances and projecting power, judged one another less by virtue and more by spectacle. Every gathering, every banquet, every procession was part of the game. Roasted swans served with clove-studded apples. Minstrels singing of his lineage. Garments lined with ermine, imported silks from Venice, embroidery so fine it could only have been stitched by monks. All of it meant one thing: I still belong here. To scale back, to serve plain bread or water down the wine, was unthinkable. It was not thrift. It was weakness. Feasting through the pain. Only a few nights after his condition had improved, William found himself once again seated at the long hall of Thornbrook Manor, beneath banners stitched with his family's coat of arms. The table was overflowing. Game birds stuffed with dried figs, honey-glazed carrots, almond pastries, and pear tarts dusted with powdered sugar. He wore his finest doublet, stitched with golden thread, and a ring on every swollen finger. The heat from the hearth mixed with the scent of roasted meat and spiced wine. Around him sat visiting lords and ladies, chattering about land disputes, hunting dogs, and rumors from the coast. William smiled and nodded where he was meant to. He lifted his goblet and laughed on cue. But under the table, his foot throbbed with every beat of his pulse, and his stomach churned with the rich foods his position had warned him to avoid. He was performing nobility, trapped in rituals that were slowly ruining his health. Yet to refuse them was to risk everything. The cage with golden bars. The image came to him during one of the quieter evenings, he, sitting alone in his study, staring into the fire. He imagined a bird, perhaps a falcon. Not the wild ones he'd watched circle above the moors, but one raised in captivity, well-fed, perfectly groomed, admired for its beauty. It lived inside a gilded cage, ornate and dazzling, placed proudly at the center of a room for all to see. The bird had never gone hungry, never faced a storm. But it had also never flown. That, he realized, was what nobility had become. He had wealth, land, and influence. But he had also inherited a script, one he was expected to follow, regardless of how it made him feel or what toll it took. The wine he poured was not for joy, but for optics. The banquets were not to nourish, but to signal power. Even the clothes he wore, stitched so tight around the waist and shoulders, felt less like garments and more like armor, fabric woven from fear and obligation. The fear of simplicity. At one point, after another long evening of forced laughter and too much wine, William confided in Lady Eleanora. "I want to stop," he whispered as she helped him unlace his boots. "All of it. The meals, the performances, the pretense." She looked at him gently. "And what then?" "I don't know," he admitted. "But I'm so tired of pretending I'm still the man they expect me to be." There was a long pause. "You know they'll talk," she said. "If you start drinking water at supper. If you stop importing saffron. If you serve stew." William nodded. "I know. They'll think I've lost money. Or lost favor. Or lost my mind." That was the tragedy of it. In the world of medieval aristocracy, voluntary simplicity was indistinguishable from failure. To downsize one's meals was to announce bankruptcy. To wear undyed wool instead of velvet was to suggest disgrace. To act humbly was to admit defeat. Even virtue, if not performed extravagantly, was suspect. A world built on appearances. The burden of status was not only financial, it was spiritual. It demanded that one serve the illusion of wealth, even when that illusion was harmful. It told noblemen like William that to be moderate was to be mocked, that comfort must be flaunted, even when it poisoned the body and clouded the mind. And worst of all, it isolated those who wore it. No one at the banquet table truly asked how William felt. No one offered to cancel the feast, or suggested he rest. They did not question the swollen knuckles or the fatigue in his eyes. They saw only the gold on his robe and the roast on his plate. They saw what they wanted to see, the performance of power. The first cracks in the mask. But inside him, something had shifted. The pain in his foot had opened a door, one he hadn't known existed. Behind it lay not just a new understanding of health, but a new view of freedom. He began to wonder whether nobility could look different. Whether strength might not lie in extravagance, but in resistance. Could a lord be respected for simplicity? Could he set a different example? He wasn't sure yet. But the idea had taken root, like a small seed in fertile soil. It would need tending and courage. But perhaps, just perhaps, he could be the first. A shift in mind and action. The turning point did not arrive with a grand gesture, nor did it come wrapped in ceremony or applause. It arrived in the small, quiet hours of a sleepless night, when the only sound in Thornbrook Manor was the wind brushing against the shutters and the occasional snap from the dying fire. Lord William Thornbrook sat upright in bed, unable to sleep. His foot throbbed with a familiar, pulsing pain, less severe than before, but enough to remind him that his body still bore the consequence of choices made long ago. The grand feasts, the endless wine, the pride that had kept him clinging to rituals he no longer believed in. Lady Eleanora stirred beside him. A woman of quiet strength and perceptive mind, she had stood beside William through both harvest and hardship. Tonight, as he sat lost in thought, she reached out and placed a gentle hand on his arm. "You're not yourself," she said, not accusingly, but with concern. "Not just from the pain. Something else weighs on you." William exhaled. "I feel trapped. Not just by my foot or my station, but by everything expected of me. The performances, the feasts, the way we live, day in and day out, all for the approval of people who don't truly see us." Eleanora nodded. "It's the cage, isn't it? The one you described." He looked at her, surprised. "You remember that?" "Of course. I've lived in it too," she said. "Every dress, every banquet, every formal smile, it's all part of the act. But we're not bound to it, William. Not unless we choose to be." A quiet rebellion begins. That conversation became a seed. It didn't sprout overnight, but the next morning, William did something that felt revolutionary in its simplicity. He declined the wine at breakfast. It was a small gesture, so small that no one commented on it. But to William, it felt like tearing off the first link in a heavy chain. Over the next few weeks, more changes followed. He began asking the cooks to prepare simpler meals, stews of lentils, boiled roots, bread baked without honey. He sent away the barrels of sweet wine and replaced them with herbal infusions made from mint, sage, and chamomile. Red meat appeared less often on his table. Instead, his diet began to resemble that of the monks he had once visited in a distant abbey, humble, nourishing, and deliberate. He spent more time reading in the garden, or walking slowly beneath the orchard trees. He meditated in the chapel at dawn and kept a journal of how he felt each day. For the first time in decades, he slept deeply through the night. And slowly, his gout began to ease. A different kind of wealth. At first, his household was baffled. The stewards whispered in confusion. The cooks raised their eyebrows. A few visiting nobles looked scandalized when offered porridge instead of pheasant. "Is Lord Thornbrook in distress?" one guest asked discreetly after being served a supper of boiled turnips and barley bread. But William, seated calmly at the head of the table in a tunic of plain blue wool, simply smiled and said, "I've eaten enough peacocks for a lifetime." It wasn't just his health that had begun to transform. It was his relationship with what it meant to be rich. He started to see wealth not as the amount of excess he could display, but in the freedom to choose differently, to live more purposefully, to cultivate space, stillness, and clarity, rather than noise and glitter. And something even more surprising began to happen. People noticed the echoes of influence. Within a few months, word had spread. Other nobles who had grown weary of their own gilded cages began to visit Thornbrook not just for political favors, but out of curiosity. They came to see the lord who had exchanged velvet for wool, who served boiled cabbage with pride, who looked more at peace than he had in years. Some scoffed, but others stayed for hours, drawn in by William's calm demeanor and sharp wit. Lady Eleanora, ever the diplomat, began hosting gatherings of a quieter sort. Small circles where poetry was read instead of power debated, where tea replaced wine, and guests were encouraged to speak honestly instead of performing. And in this gentler space, a strange thing happened. A trend began: the rise of modest opulence. Among the younger nobles, particularly those less attached to traditional power structures, a new fashion emerged, one born not of gold or silk, but of restraint. They called it modest opulence. Fine wool robes dyed in soft natural colors. Handmade wooden cups rather than jeweled goblets. Tables set with fresh herbs, stoneware bowls, and warm broth. Some of the more theatrical among them even grew small herb gardens or installed private reading nooks in their halls. Of course, some did it merely for show. Others misunderstood the message entirely, turning simplicity into yet another stage for competition. But some, a rare few, truly began to embrace the freedom that came with stepping outside the endless performance. They found themselves lighter, both in body and mind. And many of them would later credit Lord Thornbrook's quiet transformation as their inspiration. A life reclaimed. William never preached. He never lectured. He never stood in court and declared his new philosophy. Instead, he lived it, patiently, consistently, and with quiet resolve. He still carried his title. He still governed his lands. He still fulfilled his duties. But now he did so on his terms. The pageantry was gone, but the dignity remained. In its place was a kind of nobility that could not be measured in silver or silk, but in calm strength and genuine connection. In his journal, written in neat, deliberate hand, he once wrote, "Let others feast for show. Let them drown in wine and applause. I will sit under the apple tree with bread, herbs, and the woman I love. If this is poverty, may I never be rich again." The real power. What began as an illness had become a revelation. The gout, the king's disease, had once seemed a punishment. But now William saw it differently. It had broken the spell of his status. It had forced him to question, to pause, and to listen. It had taught him that true wealth was not in how loudly one lived, but in how freely one could choose. And in that freedom, he found not just healing, but peace, empathy and responsibility. It was a crisp morning in late spring when the news reached Thornbrook Manor. A fire had broken out in one of the villages on Lord William's lands. The village of Ashford, a small cluster of timber and thatch houses, had been ravaged by flames overnight. Smoke still lingered in the sky, and the villagers were left homeless, stunned, and desperate. In times past, Lord William might have sent orders from his great hall, commanding his stewards or knights to manage relief efforts. The work would be delegated, his involvement limited to signing off on funds and supplies. That was the way things were done, the tradition handed down through generations of lords and ladies. But today was different. William gathered a small entourage and rode out to Ashford himself. The journey was a stark reminder of how far he had come from the distant, aloof lord who once ruled from his ivory tower. Dust kicked up from the road as their horses clattered over the uneven path, but William felt a renewed sense of purpose. The pain that had once consumed his body still lingered, but his spirit was lighter than it had been in years. When he arrived, the scene was one of heartbreak. Blackened beams and smoldering ruins marked where homes had once stood. Men, women, and children worked together to clear debris and salvage whatever they could. Seeing through new eyes, William dismounted and walked slowly among the villagers. For the first time, he truly looked at them, not as mere tenants or sources of income, but as people with stories, fears, and hopes. An elderly woman sat beside a broken well, tears streaking her soot-covered face. A boy clutched a scorched doll to his chest. A young mother held her infant tightly, eyes filled with worry. William's heart ached. He remembered the months he had spent wrestling with pain, confined to his chambers and forced to reconsider the meaning of his own life. He realized that the suffering of his people was no different, no less real. He knelt beside the woman and offered what comfort he could, speaking softly, listening patiently. "I will help you rebuild," he promised. "Not because I must, but because I want to." More than charity, a duty fulfilled. William organized the distribution of food and blankets immediately. He ordered his men to assist with clearing the rubble and to bring materials from his own stores. From his private treasury, he allocated funds not just to repair homes, but to improve them: stronger roofs, sturdier walls, safer hearths. His actions were not about grand gestures or public acclaim. He did not call a court to announce his generosity. He simply worked alongside the villagers, coordinating efforts, sharing meals, and offering words of encouragement. In those moments, the walls between lord and subject fell away. The villagers began to see William not only as a ruler but as a protector and a neighbor. And William saw himself anew, not as a distant figure of authority, but as a steward of the land and people who depended on him. A changed lord. This experience transformed William's understanding of leadership. He recognized that true power carried responsibilities beyond the pomp and ceremony of the court. Being a lord was not simply a matter of privilege or status, it was a commitment to serve, to nurture, and to safeguard. He no longer viewed his tenants as mere laborers or sources of profit but as members of a shared community, people worthy of respect, care, and compassion. This shift rippled through the way he governed. He began instituting reforms to improve conditions on his estates, supporting better housing, fairer rents, and safer working conditions. He listened to complaints, welcomed ideas, and worked to build trust. The legacy of compassion. Lord William Thornbrook's journey, from a man trapped by his own wealth and ailments to a leader defined by empathy and responsibility, became a quiet legend. His story was not told through battles or conquests, but through the lives he touched and the community he helped rebuild. He proved that the greatest strength lay not in power or riches, but in the willingness to stand with others in their darkest hours. And in doing so, he discovered a deeper, more lasting kind of wealth, one measured not in gold or silk, but in humanity and heart. The final lesson. As the seasons changed and the village of Ashford rose anew from the ashes, Lord William Thornbrook found himself reflecting on the strange journey that life had taken him through. What had begun as a sharp, relentless pain in his toe, a symptom of gout, the so-called disease of kings, had blossomed into something far more profound, a painful but transformative lesson about wealth, society, and the human spirit. At first, William had viewed his suffering as a cruel irony, a punishment inflicted upon him because of his riches and indulgent lifestyle. After all, gout was a disease closely tied to excess, the rich man's affliction. The very luxuries he had once proudly flaunted, plentiful meat, sweet wines, lavish feasts, had betrayed him, wreaking havoc on his body. But over time, he came to see that the worst part of being wealthy in medieval times wasn't the gout itself. No, it was something far more insidious, the crushing weight of societal expectations. Trapped by expectations. In the rigid, hierarchical world of 14th-century England, wealth was inseparable from reputation and status. To be a lord meant more than just owning land or money, it meant upholding a very specific image. William understood this all too well. He was expected to host extravagant banquets, dressed in finery that often chafed his aching body. He was supposed to drink the finest wines, show generosity in ways that sometimes felt wasteful, and constantly demonstrate his power through conspicuous consumption. To stray from these norms was to risk scandal. To refuse was to be seen as weak or diminished. It was as if he had been locked inside a gilded cage, beautiful on the outside but suffocating within. The illusion of luxury. William's earlier life had been dominated by a relentless pursuit of the trappings of wealth, but as his gout worsened, those trappings turned into chains. He realized that the endless cycle of indulgence was not bringing happiness or fulfillment. Instead, it fostered a growing disconnect, from his own body, from his mind, and most painfully, from the people who depended on him. His pain was not just physical but spiritual. He had been living for appearances, catering to the expectations of others rather than listening to his own needs. The opulence that had once dazzled him now seemed hollow, even cruel. Pain is awakening. Yet, paradoxically, this pain, both the gout and the burden of social pressure, became a catalyst for awakening. It forced William to slow down, to reconsider what truly mattered. The sleepless nights spent wrestling with discomfort became moments of introspection. Conversations with Lady Eleanor deepened his understanding of himself and his place in the world. He began to embrace simplicity, health, and mindfulness. The changes weren't easy, and at times, he still faced criticism and skepticism from peers who clung to old ways. But William persisted, recognizing that true strength lay not in flaunting wealth but in mastering oneself, healing the body and soul. Through his newfound discipline, William's health improved. The swelling and agony in his joints lessened. But more importantly, his spirit healed. He discovered joy in modest meals shared with close friends and family. He found peace in quiet moments of reflection and prayer. He rekindled connections with his people, recognizing the dignity and humanity in every one of them. William's story became a testament to the power of balance, of broader responsibility. But beyond personal healing, William came to understand that his wealth and position carried a responsibility. Being rich was not an excuse for indulgence but an opportunity to lead with compassion and purpose. His efforts to aid the villagers after the fire illustrated this shift from privilege to stewardship. He saw that real nobility was shown not in gold or silk, but in actions that uplifted others. The lasting legacy. When William finally looked back on his life, he realized that the most valuable lesson the painful journey had taught him was this: true wealth was not measured by what one owned or displayed, but by the wisdom to live authentically and with empathy. His story, though rooted in the medieval past, echoes across centuries, reminding us all that the greatest burdens are often those we impose on ourselves through fear of judgment and the desire for approval. In the end, William Thornbrook's greatest victory was not over disease or enemies, but over the expectations that nearly destroyed him. Thanks for joining me on this journey into medieval life and the unexpected struggles of wealth. Lord William Thornbrook's story reminds us that sometimes, the greatest battles happen within, and that true strength comes from balance, compassion, and self-awareness. If you enjoyed this story and want to uncover more fascinating tales from history, legends, and beyond, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss an episode. I'm Thunga, and I can't wait to share the next story with you. Until then, stay curious and keep your imagination alive.
Dàn tới đây luôn á. Lấy máy là quay gửi cho anh Thịnh. Thì chớp nhán nhán được rồi. tới đây luôn á. Lấy máy là quay gửi cho anh Thịnh.
Quay nó không có rõ đâu, không quay không có rõ. Máy xịn kìa, nhưng máy này quay đâu.
Thì chớp chớp nhán nhán được rồi. dàn tới đây luôn á. Lấy máy là quay gửi cho anh Thịnh.
Quay nó có đỏ đâu, không quay không có đỏ. Má xịn kìa, chứ má này quay đâu.
Thì chớp chớp nhán nhán được rồi. dàn tới đây luôn á. Lấy máy là quay gửi cho anh Thịnh.
Quay nó có đỏ đâu, không quay nó không có đỏ. Má xịn kìa, chứ má này quay đâu.
Thì chớp chớp nhán nhán được rồi. Dàn tới đây luôn á. Lấy máy là quay gửi cho anh Thịnh.
Quay
chớp chớp nhán nhán được rồi. dàn tới đây luôn á. Lấy máy là quay gửi cho anh Thịnh.
Quay nó có rõ đâu, không quay không có rõ. Máy xịn kìa, chứ máy này quay đâu.
Thì chớp chớp nhán nhán được